So welcome to this webinar hosted by the Migration Pillar at the Bergen School of Global Studies. I'm Synnøve Bendixsen, Associate Professor at the Department of Social Anthropology, University of Bergen. I'm also a research affiliated at Christian Michelsen's Institute. And I've been working on migration issues for more than 20 years. As the pillar leader of migration at the Bergen School of Global Studies, I'm very thrilled to introduce to you this first event that we're having. Bergen School of Global Studies is a resource for multidisciplinary, research-based and practice-embedded teaching at the MA and PhD level, and is related to 5 pillars: climate change, governance, global health, inequality, and migration. Migration is a global phenomenon tied up to social inequality and processes of inclusion and exclusion. And understanding modern mobility, migration management and governance, and bordering processes requires interdisciplinary approaches. And the Bergen School of Global Studies facilitates apprehension and overview of migration studies, which are research and the research-based teaching that we have at the University of Bergen. And migration is a field of study with high emphasis at the University of Bergen. The interdisciplinarity of migration is also synthesized through the International Migration and Ethnic Relations Research Unit, IMER, at Bergen. It's a research network that includes scholars from different departments and faculties at the University of Bergen and Christian Michelsen's Institute. IMER Bergen facilitates and assists research projects, developments and applications, arrange conferences and lunch seminars, newsletters, and they also organize research courses. Recent years, we have had a very lively IMER Junior Scholar Network, which provides a platform for our PhD students to share knowledge and experiences from a variety of disciplines. Well, that was a short introduction to the migration pillar at the Bergen School of Global Studies. What I would like to do with you today for the rest of our time is to delve into the movie Mediterranea, which we have just watched, and the questions and testimonies it has provided us with. The movie is a starting point to talk about migration, the journey to Europe, and the precarious situations that many of these people are finding themselves in. And to discuss this with me here today, I have 3 excellent scholars who have each contributed in the field of migration research with inspiring work. I'm very much honored to have them as my guests here today. So let me introduce to you first Nando Sigona in the UK. Nando is based at the Department of Social Policy, Sociology and Criminology at the University of Birmingham. Nando is a social scientist with over 15 years of experience and teaching, research and teaching experience in migration, with refugee, citizenship, and ethnic studies. He is the director of the Institute for Research into Superdiversity, the IRIS, and a research associate at the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Center. And some of Nando Sigona's recent work includes Unraveling Europe's Migration Crisis with Policy Press, the Oxford Handbook of Refugee and Forced Migration Studies with Oxford University Press, and Sans Papier, the Social and Economic Lives of Undocumented Migrants with Pluto Press. And his work has also been featured in a number of international media, including The Economist, BBC News, Al Jazeera, and New York Times. I'm also happy to introduce to you Sine Plambech. She's an anthropologist, film director, and senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. She's currently a visiting professor at Yale University. Sine Plambech specializes in the area of migration, women migration, smuggling, trafficking, and the sex industry. She works and films in migration communities, border areas, red light districts, and along migrant routes from and in Nigeria, Thailand, Sicily, and Denmark. And with the multi-award film Heartbound and also the movie From Thailand to Thai, Sine Plambech stepped firmly onto the international documentary film scene. And let me just add that I used Sine's film Heartbound as part of my own teaching last year, and the students really loved it. So I can recommend you that one. And with me here today in Bergen, I have Kari Drangsland as a human geographer and gender scholar at the University of Bergen. Her PhD thesis, Working to Wait Well, exploring the temporalities of irregular migration in Germany, explored how irregularity is constructed, and with a particular focus on temporal rationalities and techniques. She's currently working on a project researching the turn towards temporary protection in European migration policies. And she's over the past 15 years worked on topics related to migration and urban planning at the cross-section of research, education, design, and art. And so before I start my questions to my really distinguished guests, I just want to remind the viewers that you're all very welcome to submit written questions on the Q&A function during the webinar. So we have watched the movie Mediterranea. It's a movie directed by Jonas Carpignano, and it was his first fiction movie. In the movie, we're following two young men from Burkina Faso going through the desert together with other migrants and refugees, and they're traveling over the ocean. We see the first period in Italy. Let me just start off this talk here today with asking each one of you how you related to this movie through the work that you have done. How did you experience that this movie resonates with your own research on the topic? And I'll start with Nando, and then Sine, and then Kari. So Nando, yeah, welcome.
Sure. Thank you. It's a pleasure to join this conversation, and unfortunately it's not in person, but maybe in the future. The work really, in many ways, while I was watching it, is almost was falling into a kind of confusion between, is this a film or is it a documentary? Because in a way it was echoing, resonating with so many of the stories that I have listened to during my research over the years, in particular in a project that I was involved in 2016, 15 and 16 on the refugee crisis, in particular looking at the journeys of migrants across the Mediterranean. That sort of kind of experience around the journeys, the violence, the economic transactions that are linked, that people have to make in order to reach, the difficulties in connecting back, with mobile phones that are, it was something that was very, very much resonating, which was, I have heard many times, but also somehow the complexities of this experience, the fact that they escape some kind of linear or simple ethics or moralities, the fact that are continuously negotiating very complex environment was something that was very interesting to watch. In another project which I've been involved, which was called Becoming Adults, which was more focused on young people on the move, particularly accompanying minor. There are also some echoes of the film in terms of the kind of choice that are made, which are very much linked to an idea of youth. No? There is dancing despite the conviction that people live in Rosarno. There is partying. There is celebrating. So there is a kind of youth energy in the film, despite all, which I found very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Nando. Synnøve, welcome to you too from Denmark.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to have this opportunity to discuss migration and film at the same time, which are two topics that I really often enjoy connecting in my own work. So I guess I watched the film as an anthropologist working with migration, but also as a filmmaker. And as Nando mentioned, it's quite clear that it's very well researched. We can discuss where it might have some flaws, but I think it's quite well researched, and it really echoes many of the findings and situations I have experienced in my own work, in particular the route from Nigeria across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean and to Sicily. I'm primarily working with women migrants, so I was of course interested in the women that we see in the film, and how they're kind of course not the main protagonists in the film, but you still kind of get glimpses of their lives. So I found that both interesting but also telling, because that's often how it is, that we get the stories of male migrants and not so often the women migrants. And even in this film that is so celebrated, the women are kind of the smaller stories that backs up the story of the men. But I still enjoyed it very much. And as Nando also said, I think what I in particular like was the way in which it managed to portray the people in the film as also having a life where they dance and have parties and have all kind of dreams and longings and desires and also fears. So it's not just this portrait of people who are not also trying to find joyful moments within all these struggles. So that was my first takeaway, and then we can go deeper into it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Karianne, how did it relate to your research?
Yeah, thank you. I also really enjoyed watching the movie, and I have been working in Germany, so I guess that's a very different context in many ways. But one thing that struck me that really resonates with my focus, because I was focusing on labor and the coupling of labor and regularization. And the film really portrays, I find, that the importance of labor in the migratory experience and also in the production of legality and illegality. And what really struck me is how the film also shows how this exploitation of people as labor power really wears down the body and also the mind. I mean, through small mundane practices, but also through accidents. So for instance, when the oranges fall off the truck in the one scene, or when you see the blood on the thumb that convinces Aiva to buy gloves to sell. So these were the kind of moments where you really see how labor plays out. And also, and I guess we will come back to that, this coupling of labor with regularization. And then also another thing that I found really interesting and that also resonates with my experiences in Hungary is how he tells Abbas at the start that, okay, you have to use time as a resource. We have to time will help us. We have to just be patient and this kind of will to struggle over time and to endure, and this kind of decision to okay, we'll stick to this is also something that I found really interesting. This way of talking about time.
And you have been working on temporality, so maybe that's something we can explore a bit later in our discussion. What I wanted to do is kind of follow the migrant journey as we see it through the movie, and because in the movie we get snapshots of the dangerous journey on the way for these migrants to fulfill their dreams in Europe. And when we first meet the lead character, Aiva and Abbas, they are in Algeria, having left Burkina Faso, and they're trying together with others to reach the Libyan shore by walking to catch a boat to Italy. And Sine, you also mentioned the gendered aspect that you have been very much studying and focused on. And I know that you've been working a lot on the Nigerian women who have reached Sicily. So did you also explore how the journey through the desert was felt and experienced by these women that you have studied?
Yes, I did. And in fact, you can say that, I mean, the film focusing on the men and also on the Mediterranean, it's also in the title, kind of leaves out, as I said before, the women, but also the crossing of the desert, which is another sea. You can say a sand sea that migrants have to cross even before they get to the shore. So in the women that I interviewed and worked among in Sicily, and also in my fieldwork in Nigeria, which would be women who had already been, and also some men who had already been in Europe, but then were deported back to Nigeria. So it was people who had done this crossing. And I should maybe also mention that even in the red light district here in Copenhagen, we estimate that around 60% of the women and the drug sellers from Nigeria have crossed the Mediterranean. So it's not something that is only taking place of people that you only meet in Southern Europe. It's part of most big cities, as we all know, across Europe. but they would often talk about this journey as they were just waiting to come to the sea, and then it will then the journey will begin. But then they were often surprised how much they had to endure before even reaching the sea. For the women, it was partly, of course, the thirst and the suffering, and some of them endured violence, but it was also, as we see in the film, they would talk about how it was the beginning of the journey before, when they arrived in Agadez in Niger, they would say that there was also parties, and they found boyfriends, and they were going to clubs, and it was kind of an exciting moment before the suffering began. So I also think that we on the one have to talk about the suffering and the pain and the dying, but we also have to acknowledge and talk about why it is that people continue to wait and what it is that makes them wait. It's for many of these young women that I followed, they had never left Nigeria before. So it was also, sometimes they would use the word adventure, but it's certainly a part of the narrative as well. What has then happened in the past years is that while they used to have a more kind of fast track through the desert, they would go from Nigeria to Agadez and then onwards to Libya and cross, then they are now in transit, because of the politics of the European politics and the Italian politics and the agreements with Libya. So now they have the women who have now crossed the desert, waiting in Libya, are now being returned. So recently I spoke with one of them, and they would say, all the women are just coming back now. So some of them are returned with IOM, but some of them have to cross the desert one more time in order to come back. So that my point is just that everything that is happening before Mediterranea is also really a big part of the story.
Absolutely. And also, have you looked at how this has changed with the COVID situation? So has the COVID had any impact on how that endurance and the waiting situation is going on?
It's been more difficult we just did a big report about that at DEES with some of my great colleagues, and we looked at the situation for migrants during COVID, and it has prolonged the transit, and it has also made it more difficult to find even temporary small jobs that can provide you with everyday money to just survive. The racism and has increased as the migrants being someone who brings the virus across borders. So this othering, even more othering than before, has certainly been part of their situation now. And we see many of them waiting in transit and trying to reroute to other destinations. I don't think we have the full picture yet, and also it's difficult to do field work now. So we have some local researchers that have told us some of these things, but we have not yet been able to do it ourselves.
Yeah, this is really something that we will hopefully soon be able to continue investigating. And I know, Nando, that you have recently completed a project on the traversal of the Mediterranean, called the Unraveling the Mediterranean Crisis. Where Synnøve was talking about the desert as an ocean, you have actually also studied that traversal of the Mediterranean. You have recently published an article, Death and Migration, Migrant Journeys and the Governance of Migration During Europe's Migration Crisis, in the International Migration Review. And you're exploring there the migrant death. So can you tell us more about that relationship between migrant death policies and migration?
Sure. One thing that is important to remember with the Mediterranean is that the film came out in 2015, but the story they're telling is the story about the pogrom of Rosarno, which is from 2010. So it's a story that is before the so-called refugee crisis, before the Arab Springs, which is really, we talk later about the potentially, we can discuss the situation in Europe, but they were capturing a different kind of migration system, okay? What is there, the system that people encounter when they arrive in Italy has changed, and this makes also a lot of difference in terms of the the condition of work. So in term, that's maybe we could discuss. The project, the big project, one on unraveling the Mediterranean migration crisis in inverted commas. We interviewed 500 people in Malta, Italy, Turkey, and Greece. The project involved University of Coventry, University of Oxford with Evan Crowley and Frank Duvel, Simon McMahon, and Catherine Jones. And one of the things we pointed out with the research is actually very much echoing what Sine said, is that there has been a huge focus on the death at sea during the 2015 summer of migration. But from an Italian perspective, I mean, for us, it started in 2013, the refugee crisis, no? With the tragedy of Lampedusa, although obviously there is a record of people having died at sea before, I mean, thousands. So it's a story that you can go back and back in terms of when it started. From the interview, particularly those that we interviewed in Italy, which was about 200 people, was very clear that they encountered experience of death, we say in the article in International Migration Review, the majority of them well before reaching the sea. No, that's the story of the desert is also with some areas which we can call hot spots of violence along the routes, which, the border entering into Libya at the time that the research was carried out. Also, there are different patterns of how violence is experienced and is also produced. There is groups that get kidnapped, and then until ransom is paid, they don't get free. So large groups are taken into farms and they stay there for a while. Or there is basically more individual level kind of violence. And what you can see in the film as well is this idea, people then have used as a way of mitigating the risk of losing their capital for the journey. They continually get the money sent from home. In a sense, I travel with as less money as possible. Also as a way of mitigating the risk of losing all my capital, because there is an understanding that, particularly from in our research, people from the Western Africa and the sub-Saharan Western Africa that were experiencing a lot of this sort of robberies along the route, for example. Interestingly enough, it was very clear that the first part of the journey was relatively safe, but then at points at which you start to encounter risk, which are points which is interesting because sometimes we forgot why the journey became more risky. It's often linked to European externalization policy. It's when it become there are more pressure on the infrastructure of the journey in terms of control, police involvement, technology, that basically then you start to see also an increase in violence, the increase of risk of death, etc., etc. So that was one of the things we observed in the research. But the point we try to make with that is that we looked at the way that the death of migrants is constructed in European responses to the refugee crisis. And we noticed that there is this obsession with the death at sea, which is interesting because it's an obsession which is echoed by a lot of the NGOs, the activists, the advocates. There is obviously the Mediterranean is a cemetery, which is true. But also the desert is a cemetery, but why we don't talk about it? And the point we try to make is that the obsession with the Mediterranean is also serve as the purpose to justify the fact that I can block departures from the Northern Africa to save lives. This is how the European policymakers explain the fact that Italy now pays the Libyan authorities to keep people back, to save them from dying at sea. If in the narratives of the policymaking narrative, you account for the risks that are associated with the externalization policies, the death in the desert, that narrative doesn't work anymore very much in terms of policy. But it's also important to acknowledge the risk before reaching the sea, because it's also explained why people, migrants are not mad. Why people get to the shore of the Mediterranean and then goes on the boats. Because the journey before was dangerous, because the experience they became before was dangerous, and that is just the last steps towards some kind of hope, and then there is a very complex story, so people that were already living, etc., etc. But that's, if we don't acknowledge the risk before reaching the sea, then we'll miss a very important part of the explanation of, the decision-making on migration.
I think that's a really important point that you're making there, Nando. to see the whole journey. And also when they are arriving to Europe, we can discuss maybe a little bit later, we see the suffering that they endure when they are in Europe, and some continue to live in Europe despite all the suffering, whereas others is like, this is enough, I'm going back. And going back despite all that enormous, dangerous trajectory one has done before that is something we can come back to. I wanted to talk with you, Kari, about the experience you had in Germany. You were interviewing and talking and doing fieldwork with Ghanesians, right? And did they talk about this journey when they were here, arriving in Europe?
Yeah. Can I just say one thing first, because it's really interesting, this point with this, the change of the violence when you kind of have arrived in Europe, because in addition to the Ghanaian people, I also did a lot of ethnographic work with Syrians. And one of the things that they discussed a lot at that time in 2017, there was a lot of anger amongst the asylum seekers towards Germany, because Merkel had come with this expression that refugees welcome, and then people came and realized that, okay, we weren't that welcome anyways. And a lot of people said that what we experienced in Syria and on the way was kind of what was war and violence, but here, waging in Germany, there's kind of these civil wars going on in our heads. And many people, actually a lot of the Syrians I worked with, some of them, a lot of them were talking about going elsewhere, also going back, because and as a man said who actually went back, that this war, this violence that was inflicted, that you lived in Syria, was actually a violence that he would rather choose over this kind of civil war going on in his mind because of this situation he had in Germany. But when it comes to the people from Ghana and Nigeria also that I worked with, they were mostly men who were part of a political collective in Hamburg called the Lampedusa in Hamburg. And these were men who had been working as guest workers in Libya and who had fled to Italy in 2011. And then they had papers, they'd gotten papers in Italy, but they found no work. And then they found that these papers were kind of useless to them. And they moved on to Germany and arrived there in 2012 and were really politically engaged. And there was a lot of protests in Hamburg, which led to a situation where these people were offered kind of a tolerated permit. That is a kind of a deportable status that they could regularize if they worked and if they proved to be self-sufficient. And the thing was that they did not want to talk about their journeys. So this was kind of 6 years after their journey from Libya. And I mean, they left Ghana many years before that again. And many of them said that on the one hand, they didn't want to re-experience the traumas and the violence, but also they were was also a kind of a political statement not to be depicted as victims because of this, because of the enormous amount of journalists and researchers who were interested in this situation, their situation in Hamburg. And to the extent we talked about the journey, it was very much in terms of a kind of a political analysis. That things that you were talking about, Nando, that were important to them when talking about the journey, externalization policies, and also the historical dimension with colonialism and foreign interest in the resources of the countries and stuff like that. But it was interesting that it was, and that relates to what you said also, Sine, there was another journey that was often a topic of the conversations, and that was the possibility of deportation. That was also very much related to death. As people would say, they were talking about the stigma of being deported, that I guess you know from your research better than I do, because I talked with people who had not been deported yet, but the fear of deportation and seeing deportation as some kind of at least social death, and then also perhaps kind of actually bodily death in Ghana was a very big topic of the conversations for these people who were deportable. And they've been for so many years. When I met them, they have lived for 5 years, having to renew their deportation, their tolerated status every 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so deportation is also another kind of violence which is inflicted on them when they are in Europe. And maybe just to return then to this question to Sine and Nando, did you experience anyone talking about returning either through the possibility to avoid deportation, and also how that was related to this incredibly dangerous journey of having arrived? So having gone through all this suffering before you arrive to Europe, then the suffering, how much suffering do they have to endure before they decide to this, enough is enough, we are actually going back? Sine, do you want to start?
I think it was actually a little bit surprising in the film that there was this conversation of enough is enough, now we are going back, because I haven't really encountered that at all. And that's very much linked actually to two things. One is that the suffering should not be in vain, that it should not be going through the Sahara Desert, watching all the death that Nando talks about, all these traumatizing experiences along the way, and being the one who then made it, and then giving up when you arrive in Sicily or Spain or where you arrive. So there's this whole more kind of existential pressure I think we often do not include in our discussions, that if you go as a human being, not as a migrant, but as a human being, you suffer through all these different things in your life, and then giving up and returning home becomes even more difficult. So that was a bit surprising in the film. And then also, as you talked about, with the waiting period, or the kind of accepting that this is a long-term project. So some of the women that I worked among, one of them just got her permanent residency in Italy after 7 years, and she felt it was many years, but she also felt that it was better than so many other people. So we also have to look at what temporality means here. And so for her, it was never a possibility to return home. And this patiently waiting, it becomes a part of the experience too, or not the experience, but that you don't want to be deported. I would also say, doing fieldwork among the Nigerians who were deported, it was very difficult lives when they return, even though there's this whole narrative that IOM will do all kind of reintegration programs. So my PhD was on the reintegration programs for Nigerian women after trafficking in Europe. And there was this whole narrative that after 3 or 6 months, they have these success stories that then can be retold in Europe, so making even more women accept to be returned. But I was following them for 1, 2, 3 years after they returned. And that was a narrative of wanting to remigrate, of still borrowing money. There was only one reintegration shop that was still alive and kind of well after 1 year. The rest of them were not functioning anymore. And they just called it deportation, whether they were voluntarily returned, as most of us working on migration will know. But so they didn't see any success stories of coming back, and that of course feeds into not wanting to return with debt, with no money, with no possibilities, often in a more vulnerable situation than before leaving.
Yeah. And thank you, Sine. Nando, do you want to follow up on that?
I guess return or being deported is the failure of the migration project. Is attached to stigma, shame. It's also linked to being able to repay the debts that many people have incurred for doing the journey in some cases. So there is both somehow more economic factors and the more sort of psychological, but also social factor. You know, it's affecting your social networks and in country of origin, etc., the prestige of your family, etc. What was interesting, I mean, we encountered most, especially for the Medmic research, we interviewed people that had arrived in Europe within 12 months from, you know, by boat irregularly within 12 months from arrival. No one really was thinking about going back anyway. It was too early. I mean, they were still trying their way of trying to understand the situation. And also because they arrived at the time when there was the Mare Nostrum search and rescue operation was in place. Italy was provided some kind of support, much more than at the time in which the story of the film is set, in a sense. So especially in the first 6 to 12 months, there's some kind of protection network, not really satisfactory, but there was at the time of the research. But what the issues of returning, we encountered more in relation to people that were already migrant in Libya in particular, and they were caught in between the civil war, warring faction, spiraling racism, a collapse of the economy, at which point, for a lot of them, basically, migration towards Europe was constructed in what we would call some kind of refugee forced migration terms. So these were economic migrants that were in Libya, then they were forced to leave Libya, and they really didn't see the possibility of going back to their country of origin as an option, also for the reason that we mentioned before. Obviously, we did the interview in Italy and in Europe, so we will not know the story of those that ever come back. So there is also kind of a methodological bias in the sampling that we need to account for. But it's certainly an important sort of aspect to understand is the meaning of the return. And if you think in terms of the forced and voluntary return, I mean, people, as Synnøve was pointing out, people knows that Italy, if you wait, you get status at some point. You get some kind of status. I mean, I've been working with Roma families from former Yugoslavia. There are 3 generations of one family in a place, and then, you know, one person gets at some point become undocumented, then they get a temporary status, another one at some point to get permanent status and then citizenship and then regularize. It's really part for people become knowledgeable about the immigration regime in the countries where they're based. They understand that basically, if you look at it from a longer term perspective, there is possibility that you get regularized. And this is confirmed by, you know, all the research in Italy that looks at the how many of the current sort of regularized population of migrants in Italy has actually gone through experience of being regularized. So that actually the large majority of the regular migrants in Italy have been basically regularized from some kind of amnesty at some point in time. I mean, at least in the in particular in some areas. One aspect which would be also interesting to think about is the geographies of migration internally in the countries. You know, this is it's the extent to which, you know, the experience that we saw in the film is very much not a generalized experience all over in Italy, but it's an experience about the south of Italy. And I'm sure that Sine has encountered it in Sicily as well. I mean, during the so-called refugee crisis, I mean, Sicily has also a place where agriculture is quite important. So that a lot of the people coming from with the boats who end up in the agriculture sector, where the level of exploitation and violence is huge. There is a kind of almost a Darwinian kind of selection that, you know, the more north you manage to get, the more chances you get of some kind of regularization, because there is more chance, the informal economy is less strong. So there is a kind of the structure of the economy shape the chance of people regularizing. And in the north, where there is the factories, if you manage to get there, you have more chances. But then it's also important if you got the network to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Nando. That picks up on a theme that I wanted us to discuss further now, namely while they're waiting for being regularized and their informal work that they are doing in that waiting for the papers and regularization. And in the movie, we're seeing the living and the working conditions of the irregular migrants in the south of Italy. And as you, Nando, also pointed out, in a particular time, this is some years ago. And they're picking oranges, right? In general, even if this was in 2015 or 14, the working conditions for migrants without legal stay is in general characterized by precariousness, no rights, dangerous work, and low paid. And Nicolas de Genova has argued that irregular migration is desired by neoliberal states because it offers a labor force that through its deportability, which we talked about, becomes flexible, dispensable, subordinated, and undermining of rights. And of course, this also has gendered aspect on what kind of informal work is available and how also these are treated. And we get a little sense of this in the movie. We're seeing the women partying with the men, and then at one point there come some Italians who interrupt the party because there are customers who are wanting some of the women. And Sine, you have done extensive work with women at Sicily. Can you say something about how this resonates with your work?
Yeah, I think it resonated really actually quite precise. I mean, when I did my field work before COVID, that was in the summer of 18, that was, it was quite evident that many of the women were working in the tourism industry. So as you pointed to with the Genova, it's this disposable labor that are available, seasonal labor that are there for the tourism and for the agriculture. One of the issues for the women was that they can try to find jobs in the tourism industry, but they did experience quite a lot of racism. So for instance, there were places in Sicily that would not allow people of color, blacks, to be in sight of the tourists because it would scare the tourists. So they could only find jobs as dishwashers and in the back of the restaurants, and there's only so many jobs there. So they were not used as domestics or as cleaning the rooms because that they should kind of be kept away. They were quite frustrated about that. Also for the women, as we know, many of them arrive pregnant or with small, they cross with babies. And so the childcare and the mothering in these seasonal jobs are quite difficult because they would maybe live in a refugee center that would or in a camp that would encourage them to find work. But the farm where they could pick oranges during the season would be far away, and there would be no public transport. So there was a lot of logistics going into it that we often do not really consider, which was making the life for the men, but for the women who had to be mothering at the same time as workers. So their solution was what we see in the film was to sell sex. And so they would sell sex for around 20 euros to the African migrants who also are sex buyers, and to the Italian men for around 50 euros. And that's so much more than you can make in a day as dishwasher or in the agriculture. So they were trying to bridge that. I have an article coming out soon that kind of looks at how to be mothers and migrants in this irregularized field. They had to sell sex and have these intimate relations to men to bridge that. And at the same time, they are asked by migration authorities to show that they are good mothers in order to get residency, because if they do not provide for their children who are born in Italy, then they might be either sent back without their children or with their children. But this whole mothering is a big part of this discussion.
Yeah. So would you say then for these women, the regularization was less tied up to being a good worker than being a good mother? Was it
It's both. I mean, they still need the contract. They would get the contract. They would for 2 months cleaning dishes or picking oranges, and that's not enough to get a residency. So for them, they would often depend on the children. When the children have learned enough Italian, they have been to school, they have come Italianized, they would be considered as someone who have more attachment to Italy than to the home country. And then the mother will be allowed to stay in Italy in order to take care of that child. So they would often use, kind of skip the idea of ever getting a contract and then depend on the child.
Oh, okay. So I think this is very interesting. I didn't know this, and it's very different, I think, than the relationship between work and regularization and being a good citizen that you found in Germany, which of course the regularization process in Germany is very different from what we find in Italy.
Yeah. So and it should be said here that I base my also I worked a lot with tolerated migrants. So these are kind of irregular migrants that are hyper visible to the state. I mean, they're deportable, but they have to go and renew their deportation, like the toleration permit, every 6 months or 3rd month or every 2nd week.
Yeah.
But many of these migrants get a work permit. Okay. And there's a lot of scholars that have, like scholars such as Sandro Mesadra and Sabine Hess have argued that since 2015, there's been a reconfiguration of the German migration regime towards a stronger coupling of labor and regularization. So Germany has been, like, historically really restrictive in giving people working permits and also in having amnesties or regularization. People are tolerated if they get their asylum applications. If they get a negative asylum decision, they are given this tolerated status. So, but since 2015, and due to like an enormous shortage of labor in Germany, there's been kind of this very strong coupling of residence and labor, and it's very formalized and very organized, but the demands are much higher. So there's, for instance, this new regulation that states that tolerated migrants have to work for 30 months with a certain amount of income and tax, paying taxes and social security in order to get regularized. So that means that people are really living with this tolerated status for many years in Germany now. Yeah. And of course, if you have the tolerated status, it is also, you have this ID card with this red line stamped over the ID card. And in Germany, you have to show your ID card for all kinds of things, going to the gym, buying a phone, getting an apartment. So that means that you're really stigmatized and you really have a hard time getting an apartment. So many of these people will have to stay in cramped asylum camps through all these years. Yeah. But it's really interesting because in Germany, you see, so I call my thesis working to wait well. And this is because in Germany, this kind of waiting for regularization or waiting for a good life is very much related to whether you get work and whether you really get a salary and pay your taxes. Yeah. But also that means that waiting becomes kind of a normative expectation that you're actually able to find work, notwithstanding racism and your precarious situation, and that you're able to stay in this situation with kind of showing good character in a way. Because work is also, of course, related to what kind of a worker you are. Yeah. So it's and in Germany there's really been a focus on getting, for instance, deportable Afghan migrants into vocational training programs because there's a lot of lack of skilled workers. So you have like this change towards, in Germany in public schools they call it lane change. So they have really put into force a lot of new regulations that will make asylum seekers change from the lane of asylum to the lane of labor. So this is really a big transformation in the German. But I think it's important to say that this coupling of regularization and labor, you see that also in Denmark and in Norway, and that must be seen in relation to this change towards temporary protection statuses, also within refugee law.
And the temporality of being allowed to stay is also related to gender, right? The same with regularization. So Nando, you were mentioning this Becoming Adult, which was a project I know you did some years ago, where we see how there's an age dimension also to this aspect of regularization, and how that is possible for some, and how it is also related to poverty, maybe also. You're muted, Nando.
So in terms of poverty and destitution, I mean, if you look at research that we have done particularly in the UK, we've seen increasingly how the poverty is weaponized against the migrants. No, this is partly within the narrative about the hostile environment policy that the British government has been implementing since the beginning of the 2010 with the then Home Secretary Theresa May, this idea of making life difficult, which was something that was already present in some of the labor policy in a sense, but this idea that deporting people is a very expensive thing to do. So what we're doing is that we make the conditions so bad that people may want to leave as a result of the condition we have created, but also we make this condition so bad that other people may want to find our country as attractive. So also as a tool for deterrence. So poverty, in a sense, is almost turning the table on the Genova argument here. No, it's not that the legal status creates the vulnerability that so people are exploitable. That's probably true. Actually, the law creates the poverty as a way of enhancing an anti-immigration narrative. So there is also that kind of dimension there. The issues of regularization. I mean, within sometimes we forget, and this is also linked to obviously the work that Nikos Degeno has been doing as well. The production of illegality is also linked to what idea of legality exists in the different countries, isn't it? The rule of law. I mean, there is fantastic work on the anthropology of illegality in Russia or in the former Soviet republics. What's the value of a legal paper in a place where legality is not this at all, the rule of law is not exactly, the standard. But similarly, you're going to apply this argument in Italy. No? What's the value of the paper in a place where the economy works on informality? Especially in the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector will not survive if it was all regularized in terms of the costs and the supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to reflect also on the different, in different European countries, there is different expectation. I mean, obviously, Karian mentioned the fact that you need to present the ID card everywhere to access things in some places. In Italy, in theory, by law, you should walk around with your ID card, but very rarely that's make a huge difference. I mean, people walk around with everything they get from the police, piece of papers, tissues, anything which looks like a paper. Which is also one of the criticisms about, you're talking about undocumented. People are over-documented. It's just not the right one. They actually, even if you got the paper, doesn't really make a huge difference in some cases. There is the issues of racism, which is sometimes is left behind in the way that we look at the regularization issues and the way the immigration regime works is clearly racialized, and sometimes within migration research, and I know that now there is all this sort of push towards acknowledging more the role of race, but it's very clear how some of the experience of the people in the film was very much linked not as much to them being migrant, but the fact of them being Black, and it's in many cases. Or obviously it's intersectional, but there is a lot of racism as well that is really embedded within societies in Italy and elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about this issue of regularization as well. Now I was on the phone now with some of the people I worked with, the Afghan young men I worked with in 2017. Talking now with them how COVID affected. These were people with a tolerated status who, of course, now when the US are pulling out of Afghanistan, they're of course insecure what will happen to them. But these are people, young men who has found work or are in vocational training programs in order to, like, as tolerated migrants. And we talked about now. They said that, like, living with this kind of being deportable in Germany, but still having this attachment to Germany through work. Many of them said now that they're kind of not, regularization isn't so much the goal anymore, because how the German system is, like, it's structured according to at least social rights. So you get kind of full social rights if you're working. And although now there's changes in Afghanistan, many of these men have started to kind of believe that we will not be deported. Like, we are useful for the economy. We have this kind of craft skills. So, and I found that also interesting, that the desire kind of to be regularized over, like, in these 4 years that these people have been in Hamburg, has kind of it is now changing when they see that now we're kind of working in this craft sector in Germany and having the social rights that like German people have. So my point is, yeah, I just find it important just that we have regularization that is not always the goal of people either.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For instance, most of the people from Ghana I worked with they had been regularized in Italy, but they could not do anything with the papers. There were no futures in the papers, they said. I mean, there was no jobs for them. So then.
But in the movie, we see how they use their ethnic network and their family network, which becomes a way into the informal market, and also maybe ways in which they can do the regularization process. Did they have that opportunity in Germany?
Well, many of the people I worked with, they were living in asylum camps. And in Germany, they have this regional dispersion system of asylum seekers, and you're not allowed to travel out of the Bundesland or the region where you are to which you are assigned. And also there is this very strong temporal and spatial disciplinary system in the asylum camps. So you're not allowed to leave the camps more than 3 days. Then you will lose your place in the camp and be relocated as punishment. And you are also not allowed to have visitors except from certain points of the day. Yeah. And of course, also Germany has this policy of poverty. So they have taken away the social support in the camp. So people they need to be there to the meal hours, and also they need to be there at the set to mail hours when you get the mail from the immigration authorities. So people felt really that they had to be in the camps, and that of course was also something that contributed to made it hard to uphold the networks in Germany. Yeah. Although many people had relatives and had networks dispersed over Germany, it was hard to access these networks, except from, of course, the digital media and social media. But there was really this thoroughly regulated temporal schedule in the camps that people had to.
Yeah, and the role of the family sometimes is also related to the reason for leaving, and also Nando talked about the shame in return. So it's also shame for the family and a feeling of failure, that you failed your family who are waiting for you at home. Our time is getting really close to the end. We have received some questions from the audience that I would like to link two of the audience to one of the questions that I actually have, because one of the questions were related to the in terms of distribution of the film and screenings, also online. How do you target policymaker and those directly involved with refugee regulations and the decisions they make? So of course, we didn't make this movie. This was made by a film director, but both Nando and Sine have experience with creating movies related to their research. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Let me just add two more questions since we only have 3 minutes left. The second question is, did you get informed or inspired by the odysseys lived by migrants from Mexico to the US? So maybe you can respond to that in your research. But my question actually was that there has been a lot of movies about migration and refugees the last 7 and 8 years. And so what do you think, and you have worked with different medium and how to get your research across. So what is the potentiality in this case of the fiction movie in transmitting research-based knowledge? So let's take a final round on those questions. Who wants to go first?
I can start. I mean, one of the issues with this film is obviously that it is fiction, and because migration is such a political issue, I often find that that fiction film makes it more possible for policymakers to dismiss it as fiction. Whereas in my own work as documentary filmmaker and kind of worked on 6 different documentary films, I really see that that documentaries is more of a document, a testimony, it's evidence. I wouldn't say in the same way as research, but you can get there. I mean, one of the films that I have been involved with, we filmed over 10 years, the film that you mentioned, Synnøve, Heartbound. And that in that case, you can really use it as a document when you discuss with policymakers. So I would say that when you look at the films that have been out for the past 8-10 years, documenting the refugee crisis, those that have the biggest difficulty in reaching policymakers or changing anything, if that would ever be possible, is fiction films, and those that are too artistic. So we have also seen films that are more kind of abstract or dreamy, and you kind of see how the ghosts of the migrants are kind of flying over the Mediterranean. Those kind of films are very difficult to use politically. In my experience, you have to be quite clear on your message and your audience, and documentary films, I think in that case is stronger. But that doesn't mean that a film like this, which is thoroughly based on research, has potential. But I think we should certainly be aware that fiction can more quickly be dismissed as fiction.
Thank you. Yeah. Nando?
I mean, obviously, I'm not a filmmaker, so I'm not looking from that angle, but I think you can look at this slightly differently, because I mean, the emotions, the politics of emotion was central in the refugee crisis. Was like very important, you know, all the moment for refugee welcome, the solidarity, the objection, and the disgust for the tragedies at sea, the people dying, etc. So in many ways, you could look at a fictional film not as targeted at the policymakers who actually know the stories. They're just, I mean, in a way, the point is not for them to find out things, but it's actually for them to be forced to find out, to acknowledge things. It's a different kind of work to do. But in a sense, a film like this may potentially, but I'm not 100% sure. This film is slightly strange because this is almost a film about an historical event, the pogrom of Rosarno, which has been fictionalized and memorialized in this way. So it's not a story about migration only. It's something slightly different. But I think in a sense, a film like this can basically mobilize those emotions that then can become pressure against the politicians for doing things. So in a sense, it can help in that way. I think I got a question in the question and answer that I can take the opportunity to answer as well, which is around the Arab Springs. What's the role of the Arab Springs because I mentioned it briefly. I mean, the Arab Springs means many things in the Italian context, but more broadly. Obviously, the Arab Springs is what started in many ways the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis on one end. The Syrian refugee crisis. The Arab Spring is also linked to the collapse of the Libyan regime and Gaddafi, which meant the loss of one of the main immigration hubs in Northern Africa, which also meant a huge sort of onward migration from Libya. And it's also transformed a lot of the routes which were available, and making, for example, in a situation of loss of control of the Libyan territory meant that the role that Gaddafi had played up to the point in terms of controlling migration for Europe and putting people into desert prisons and just, you know, the bouncing back of arrival, etc., couldn't work anymore. So it played a lot of different roles, but it also played another role, which I discussed in the paper I wrote with Indeas in 2012, which is called Migration and Revolution, is very much looking at the Arab Springs as the product of the closure of legal routes for young people from Northern Africa to go to Europe. So young people stranded in Northern Africa becoming basically an uprising because of them being stuck there, and sort of a different kind of way of looking at the chain of migration and revolution.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you, Nando, for answering that. Do you want to finally say something about the potentiality of fiction movie or different ways of communicating research?
Yeah, well, I have not, I don't have much any experience with making movies, but I worked a lot with photographers in my work in Norway, and I think that one of the things that photographs do, or I also worked a lot with sound, but also these movies that it allows you, and this has been one of the things that I've been struggling with when I working critically, for instance, in a Foucauldian framework or something, as an ethnographer, it's so easy that the stories of people, that their agency and their decisions and the practices kind of get, yeah, you can't convey it in this, or you close the openness and you kind of close down the complexity. And I felt that, to me, this movie kind of made possible, as you said, both of you at the start, that you saw that people kind of live real lives, like as complex and relational and embodied human beings.
Yeah.
And still, I found that this movie, through small details, made and illuminated the more complex migration regime, and also the link between capitalism, like exploitation, labor power, and migratory, the migration regime in Italy. So kind of the movie, like also these details, when you do ethnographic work, you often sense that it is in the uneventful, mundane details that you find the knowledge, that you actually found this, you see the complexity where you see how the relations of power play out and set people's lives in different ways, and how they navigate it and negotiate it. And I found that for me, this movie was good in the way that it had some of these details that you could really, that were kind of uneventful. For instance, this thing with the gloves that really, I found really strong, that really conveyed a lot about this system, and also about a bit many, like it conveyed so much when he took up this, okay, I'll buy these clothes and sell them. It was, so.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really a good way of ending our discussion. We have done a full circle then, I feel. I'd like to thank my guests here, Sine Plambech, Nando, Sigona, and Kari Drangsland. I'd like to thank the audience that you have asked questions and being here. And please stay tuned to the next events that Bergen School of Global Studies will be doing. So thank you so much for today.